While Hollywood showed gunslingers feasting around perfect campfires, the reality of food for Old West outlaws was just as brutal as the bullets they fired. In this video, you'll find out what Old West bandits really ate, what the diet was like in the Old West between escapes and hideouts, and why food in the American Old West had nothing to do with what cinema showed the world for decades. These were men living between the rope and the trigger, with hunger as a constant companion. The historical food of the Old West was defined by a single word: survival. The first lie starts with something you've seen in almost every Western film. In the movies, the scene repeats like a nearly sacred ritual. The gang of outlaws resting at dusk, horses tied to trees in the background, and at the center of the camp, a crackling fire with golden meat slowly turning over the embers. Someone passes a bottle of whiskey while the leader maps out plans for the next heist. There's comfort, there's plenty, there's time to spare. It's the American Old West the way Hollywood spent decades insisting it was. But the reality of what food was like in the Wild West for men on the run was radically different. And one surprisingly simple technical detail explains why: smoke. In open country, the smoke column from a campfire can be spotted from miles away under normal visibility conditions. You didn't need to be a professional tracker to locate a camp that way. In the operational records of the U.S. Marshals Service, preserved in the United States National Archives, federal agents describe exactly that method of location during active pursuit operations, scanning the prairies for smoke columns. A generous campfire was, in practice, an involuntary location signal visible to any lawman operating in the area. It was the 19th century equivalent of switching on a spotlight in the middle of darkness and hoping nobody looked in the right direction. The practical consequence for those living outside the law was brutal and immediate. Many outlaw groups spent entire nights without lighting any kind of fire. They ate cold, in forced silence, in a hurry, often still mounted on their horses, ready to move at any second, on many occasions without cooking absolutely anything. Not for lack of will or ingredients, but because survival demanded that kind of iron discipline. Jesse James and his gang lived that reality with growing intensity throughout the entire decade of the 1870s. Especially after the disastrous bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota in September of 1876, when the plan went completely wrong. 2 gang members were killed during the shootout in the streets of the town, 3 others were captured days later, and only Jesse and his brother Frank escaped wounded into a weeks-long flight through the frozen Minnesota wilderness and then through Missouri. The group spent long stretches depending almost exclusively on dry provisions carried in there. Saddlebags. Historian T.J. Stiles, in his extensively researched work, Jesse James, Last Rebel of the Civil War, documents how during that period the James brothers avoided any campfire with nearly military rigor. Total mobility was worth infinitely more than any hot meal. Stopping meant being found. Being found in that context meant being hanged. When there was a fire, it was lit with as little material as possible, kept burning for the shortest time necessity allowed, and extinguished before the smoke column became noticeable at a distance. Used only to boil water, critical for avoiding gastrointestinal diseases that killed just as surely as bullets, to heat something in a medical emergency or on rare occasions of relative safety in well-protected terrain. No golden meat slowly turning over generous embers. No rustic feast under the starlit sky of the Kansas prairies or the New Mexico territory. Think now about the real smell of those camps on cold Missouri or Wyoming nights. Not of seasoning and roasted meat like the movies suggest, but of leather soaked by rain, horse sweat after hours of hard riding, gunpowder soaked into clothes that hadn't been washed in days or weeks, and cold beans swallowed in a hurry in the dark while eyes swept the horizon looking for any suspicious movement. The distant creak of a wagon, the howl of a coyote in the hills, the faint jingle of spurs from someone who might be a lawman or might be an innocent traveler. and there was no way to know which until it was too late. That was the real smell and sound of life for outlaws of the Wild West. Not glamour, raw necessity and constant vigilance. Today, that might sound like dramatic exaggeration. But think of it this way. When you forget your lunch at home and have to eat something cold on the go at work, you already consider that situation uncomfortable enough to complain about. Now imagine that restriction exists not for lack of resources, but because lighting any heat source might mean a federal marshal locates your camp overnight and shows up at dawn with a death warrant in hand. For outlaws of the far west, every cold meal was literally a survival calculation, not an aesthetic or philosophical choice. The myth of the perfect campfire and roasted meat doesn't survive its first contact with the historical documents of the era. And that's just the first level of the deconstruction. Because the next myth is about a food you probably never imagined as the true centerpiece of a gunslinger's diet. And it has far less cinematic glamour than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. If there's a single food that defines simple Old West food, whether for honest cowboys driving cattle across Texas, outlaws hiding in Wyoming canyons, or soldiers on campaign through Indian territory, that food is not the juicy steak the movies love to show. It's not the whiskey flowing through saloons. It's not even beef jerky, though that matters too. It's beans. Dried beans were the fuel of the American West for purely practical and non-negotiable reasons. Light to carry in a saddlebag or canvas sack, cheap to pick up at any frontier store, capable of lasting months without any kind of refrigeration, and nutritionally dense enough to sustain a man through hours of intense riding. When cooked with chunks of smoked bacon or melted lard, they provided enough protein and calories for a full day of heavy physical activity in the field. It was the perfect food for men who needed to keep moving constantly, and needed to do so without depending on any infrastructure whatsoever. And that was the real menu for a large portion of Old West outlaws. Cooked beans, often with chunks of salt pork or salt-cured meat, rounded out with naturally leavened bread, the famous sourdough bread, or by a specific biscuit that deserves special attention, because it reveals a lot about what Old West bandits ate when options dropped to a minimum. That biscuit was hardtack, made with just 3 ingredients, flour, water and salt with no yeast and no fat. The result was a virtually indestructible cracker, hard as compressed rock, that could be stored for months without significant deterioration under ideal conditions of low temperature and humidity. American soldiers used it extensively during the Civil War between 1861 and 1865. Sailors carried it on long Atlantic crossings. Cowboys and outlaws stuffed it into their saddlebags as emergency provisions and many times as their primary provisions during the toughest stretches. The problem was eating it. Too hard to bite directly without risking cracking a tooth, hardtack had to be soaked in warm water, hot coffee or broth to soften enough to be chewed with any efficiency. And even after softening, the unpleasant texture lingered, a pasty, rubbery consistency that no amount of hunger could make enjoyable. There was also a more disturbing and consistently documented problem. After weeks or months of storage, especially in humid climates like the Missouri river bottoms or the Texas lowlands, it was common for hardtack to show visible infestation by larvae or weevils. Historical accounts are consistent on this specific point, and the conclusion is always the same. The men ate it anyway. Hunger was a more urgent force than any hygienic consideration or personal preference. There was no alternative. It was that or nothing. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the most famous outlaw duo of the late 19th century, operated across an enormous territory spanning Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and Indian Territory. Aunt Bassett, known as the Queen of Browns Park Basin, and one of the figures associated with the circle of Cassidy's sympathizers in that isolated region, left detailed accounts of the everyday food routine in the Wild Bunch camps during the group's peak years. Her description is repetitive to the point of seeming monotonous to a modern reader. Beans, bacon, strong coffee, and hard bread, day after day, week after week, with minimal variation determined only by occasional access to towns or friendly ranches that could provide something different. Historian Robert Utley, in Billy the Kid: A Short and Violent Life, one of the most rigorously researched biographies of the famous New Mexico outlaw, describes a virtually identical dietary pattern for William Bonney. Even during periods when Billy had access to the small towns of Lincoln County or the ranches of trusted contacts, the base diet didn't vary substantially: beans, jerky, coffee, and occasionally something obtained by other means. A chicken, fresh eggs, green corn from the field of some farmer who looked the other way. Beans were so central to frontier American culture that a specific language developed around them. The group's cook, called Cookie in the world of cowboys and outlaw gangs, held a position of real authority that went far beyond the purely culinary function. Knowing how to prepare a decent pot of beans with whatever resources were available, managing provisions intelligently so they lasted beyond what was planned, using every piece of bacon at the strategically right moment to maximize flavor and nutritional yield. Those were skills that determined the cohesion or the breakdown of a group under constant pressure. Andy Adams, in The Log of a Cowboy, one of the most accurate and detailed accounts ever written about everyday life on the American frontier in the 1880s, calculated from memory that during a cattle drive of roughly 4 months across Texas and Indian Territory, he ate beans at more than 90% of his daily meals. It wasn't an exception, it was the documented and widely shared norm. The diet of cowboys in the 1800s and of the outlaws living on the margins of the same system was simple, not out of philosophy or rustic romanticism, but out of an absolutely concrete necessity that defined every decision of every single day. In October of 1880, Pat Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County in the New Mexico Territory with a mission that had almost personal dimensions: capture William Bonney, Billy the Kid. During the following months, Billy moved in continuous flight across the territory, sleeping in the ranches of acquaintances for a day or two, disappearing before dawn, covering impressive distances on horseback between the Pecos River and the Sacramento Mountains. With a $500 bounty on his head, a sum that represented more than a year's wages for a common cowboy, every hour spent still was an hour of calculated and very real risk. In the movies, the answer to that constant need for food on the move would be obvious and romantically simple. Billy hunts, spots a deer at dusk, drops the animal with a single clean shot, lights a discreet fire in some sheltered canyon, roasts the meat at ease, and wakes up refreshed for another day of adventure. The wild and abundant West providing generously for whatever the fugitive needs. You just need to know where to look. But the historical records of what people ate on horseback journeys in the real Old West tell a radically different story. And understanding that difference completely changes the image of the outlaw as a historical figure. Hunting takes time, and time was the scarcest resource in the life of any man in active flight. It requires you to stay in a specific location long enough to track, locate, approach without being detected, and effectively bring down a game animal of useful size. An adult deer can require hours of silent tracking before being spotted in a favorable position for a shot. The shot itself, inevitably loud, impossible to silence with the technology of the era, immediately alerted anyone nearby to the presence of an armed individual at that location. The process of field dressing and rough preparation of the carcass added another 1 to 2 hours to the total process. And throughout that entire sequence, an outlaw with an active bounty on his head was completely stationary at a fixed location, visible to anyone who knew where to look, and leaving easily followed trails of blood and organic remains across the terrain. For outlaws in real active flight, hunting was a high-risk luxury reserved for very specific circumstances, not the base food strategy that the movies suggest. What dominated the diet of outlaws on the move were foods that could be carried without refrigeration and consumed without complex or time-consuming preparation. Dried beef, beef jerky, pemmican, cornmeal, raw beans to cook when there was enough opportunity and safety to do so, and the hardtack already mentioned. Jerky was the protein food of choice for men living in constant motion. The process of salting and drying in the sun or in smokehouses drastically reduced the original weight of the meat. It's estimated that jerky weighs roughly 1/5 of the equivalent fresh meat, making transport far more efficient for men who needed their horses moving fast. With the reduced weight, no need for refrigeration, and durability of weeks to months depending on weather conditions, a well-stocked outlaw could ride for an entire week without needing to hunt, steal, or cook anything at all. Pemmican deserves special attention in this discussion because its regular presence in the diet of Old West outlaws points directly to something that American cinema systematically ignored: the fundamental role of the culinary and survival knowledge of Native American peoples in the everyday life of frontier men. Pemmican was a creation of the Plains Indian nations, especially the Lakota, Cheyenne, Blackfoot, and Comanche. The process involved drying bison or deer meat until completely rigid, grinding it into a fine powder, mixing it with rendered animal fat in liquid form, and when seasonally available, dried wild berries such as choke cherries or buffalo berries. The result was a caloric concentrate of extraordinary density and durability. It's estimated that a small amount of well-prepared pemmican provided enough energy for hours of intense physical activity, and under proper storage conditions, pemmican remained edible for months, sometimes exceeding a year without significant deterioration. There are archaeological records of pemmican found at historical Native American campsites that was still in consumable condition long after the site had been abandoned. The Plains Indian peoples had used this food for centuries on long hunting, warfare, and seasonal migration journeys across the vast territories they inhabited long before the arrival of the first European settlers. Cowboys, American soldiers, and white outlaws learned the technique, sometimes directly from native people they had real contact with, sometimes through commercial intermediaries, sometimes from other frontiersmen who already knew the food. D. Brown, in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, points out with precision and without romanticism how the culinary, medicinal, and survival knowledge of the Plains Indian nations was systematically incorporated by white settlers, often without any public acknowledgement of that historical debt. The pemmican that kept a fugitive alive during days of non-stop flight was the direct product of centuries of technical refinement developed by native nations, earned in the harshness of those same prairies long before any white gunslinger ever set foot in that territory. Today, we have industrialized protein bars and high-tech energy foods serving exactly the same logistical function: portable caloric concentrate for extreme physical demand and field situations. Pemmican was the handcrafted 19th century equivalent, developed by cultures that the official American historical narrative took decades to recognize as technically sophisticated and rationally adapted to their environment. Opportunistic hunting happened naturally when conditions allowed: a rabbit crossing the path at close range, a bird caught off guard in low brush, chickens stolen from an isolated farm at dusk. But that was exactly what it was: opportunistic and random. Never systematic, never planned as the primary food strategy for men who lived on the run. The diet in the Old West for men in real flight was defined by dry, portable, and long-lasting foods, not by the wild abundance that's always available, that the American Western always promised on the big screen. Push open those swinging doors. The impact is immediate and multiple. wet, darkened sawdust on the floor of uneven wooden planks, tobacco in a thick smoke that soaks into clothes and hair within minutes, the sweet and sharp smell of cheap alcohol mixed with the accumulated sweat of men coming in from weeks in the field without a bath. In the background, the heavy perfume of the women working in the establishment trying to cover every other smell. The noise is constant and layered, glasses banging on the dark, grimy wooden bar, chairs scraping the floorboards, voices raised in argument or forced laughter. Someone at the piano trying to play something that nobody was really listening to. Behind the long bar, a dusty and scratched mirror reflected brown and amber bottles unevenly lined up along the wall. It's here, in this familiar scene, that the Western imaginary places outlaws finally well-fed after weeks of deprivation. The saloon is a space of plenty and well-earned rest. Juicy steaks, fresh oysters from who knows where, elaborate meals, all washed down with quality whiskey and served with the rustic hospitality of the American frontier. But the typical food of the real American Old West, served in real saloons, told a far more prosaic and revealing story about how those towns that grew faster than any infrastructure could keep up with were concretely organized. In the majority of establishments in frontier towns, Dodge City in Kansas, Tombstone in the Arizona Territory, Abilene and Wichita along the cattle trails, Deadwood in the Dakota Territory, food was offered in a basic fashion, and in many cases practically free alongside the purchase of a drink. This was not an act of genuine generosity. It was a deliberate and widely practiced business model by experienced proprietors. Salty, low-cost food encouraged the consumption of more drink, which was where the real profit margin was. It was pure commercial calculation disguised as hospitality, and the menu that calculation produced was consequently the cheapest and most basic possible. Reheated salt-cured meat, bread that had gone stale since morning, beans cooked and reheated multiple times, sometimes a thin soup or a stew with meat of origins that were best left uninvestigated. Nothing that remotely resembled the juicy steak that shows up in the movies. Historian Walter Prescott Webb, in The Great Plains, a reference work on the history and geography of the American prairies, describes the supply chain for saloons and frontier establishments as structurally precarious and systematically irregular. Meat arrived salt-cured for weeks before being served to the customer. Grains could be old and smelling rancid, flour with unwanted insects present. The water used in food preparation, of unpredictable quality, depending on the local source available on any given day. The Tombstone Epitaph, the local newspaper of the Arizona Territory that covered in real time the most intense years of Tombstone, including the period when Wyatt Earp and his brothers held positions of authority in the town, the confrontation at the OK Corral in October of 1881, and everything that came after, published repeated complaints from residents and visitors about the quality of food served in local establishments. It was not uncommon for less scrupulous proprietors to mix horse meat with beef to cut acquisition costs, or to serve products in advanced stages of spoilage simply because there was no fresh merchandise available to replace them. Health inspection as an applied concept with practical consequences simply did not exist in that frontier environment. Doc Holliday, a tubercular dentist, professional gambler, and Wyatt Earp's partner in Tombstone, was an extreme and well-documented case of dietary difficulty in the saloon environment. His tuberculosis severely affected his appetite, digestion, and ability to retain consumed foods. Accounts from contemporaries who spent time with Holliday both in Tombstone and earlier in Dodge City consistently describe a man who frequently went entire days barely consuming any solid food of any quantity, sustained primarily by whiskey, strong coffee, and when his momentary physical condition allowed, pieces of barely cooked meat he could hold down. His extreme thinness and his appearance of chronic illness were openly remarked upon by everyone who knew him well. The man that films portray with physical vigor, imposing presence and nimble movements was, in the documented historical reality, a tuberculosis patient in advanced stages, whose relationship with food was one of permanent difficulty, suffering, and involuntary rejection. Wyatt Earp was more pragmatic about food, as he was about nearly every practical aspect of life. In his personal accounts, compiled with Earp's generous cooperation by journalist Stuart Lake, in the work Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, he describes meals in Dodge City without any romanticism or nostalgia. Beans, salt-cured meat, bread, strong coffee, the same basic menu of any frontier worker of that period. When something of superior quality was available by some fortunate chance, Earp took advantage without ceremony. When there wasn't, he ate what was there without any recorded complaint. For the outlaw who occasionally entered a saloon with money in his pocket or simply to observe the town's movements, the priority was always strategic, never gastronomic. Back firmly pressed against a wall or a post, eye constantly on the swinging doors and the side entrance, hand always within reach of the revolver. The food was whatever was available at that moment, not what one wished for or imagined might exist. And what there was, almost invariably in any frontier town of the 1870s or 1880s, was reheated beans and bread that had gone stale since the beginning of the day. There is one aspect of Old West gunslinger food that the movies systematically avoid showing honestly, because it would make the outlaws far less romantically appealing and far more human in their everyday brutality. Most of them stole food frequently and regularly. Not just banks, stagecoaches, and gold-laden trains, food too. And with a regularity that local archives document without ambiguity. Isolated farms were frequent and practical targets for groups on the move that needed provisions without the risk of showing up in towns with authorities. A property far from any urban center, with owners absent during their working day or intimidated by the armed presence of 4 or 5 armed men showing up in the morning, was an immediate and relatively calculable source of provisions. Chickens, fresh eggs, corn stored in sacks in the barn, flour, smoked ham hanging from the rafters, salted meat in barrels, roots and tubers from the storage cellar. Any accessible and portable provisions were taken without ceremony. Horses were stolen for riding, and the saddlebags and packs strapped to those horses went along with all the contents they held. Butch Cassidy's gang, the Wild Bunch, as it was recorded in documents of the era, was particularly systematic and pragmatic in this strategy throughout the most intense years of operation, between 1896 and 1901. Operating across vast territory between Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and Indian Territory, the group developed over time an informal network of sympathizers spread across farms and ranches strategically located on their habitual escape routes. That network provided shelter, food, and information about the movements of authorities in exchange for money from the robberies. Promises of protection against other violent groups operating in the same region, or simply out of calculated fear of what refusing might mean for a family isolated days of riding from any town with a sheriff's office. Historian Richard Patterson documented this operational structure in considerable detail in Butch Cassidy, a biography, researching local records from farmers and residents of the region over years of fieldwork. When the sympathizer network was out of reach or had been compromised by law enforcement investigations, the theft was direct and without euphemism of any kind. Ride up to an isolated farm, show up in enough numbers to eliminate any practical attempt at resistance, take what they needed efficiently, stored sweet potatoes, sacks of cornmeal, live chickens to eat in the days ahead, smoked meat hanging in the barn, cured cheese, eggs, and disappear before any messenger could reach the nearest town and draw attention. Camp food in the Old West for outlaws was, therefore, a mosaic of overlapping strategies. provisions purchased in locations considered safe and discreet, provisions stolen from isolated farms when necessary, dried foods carried for days in saddlebags as a reserve, and beans always present, always cooked when the security situation allowed for a fire, always cold and swallowed in a hurry when prudence demanded absolute silence in the camp. What makes this pattern historically relevant goes beyond dietetics. This systematic behavior created an acute and documented paradox in the mythology of Old West outlaws that cinema never fully wanted to dismantle. Figures like Jesse James were celebrated in popular ballads and in certain sympathetic newspapers as defenders of the poor. An American version of Robin Hood who robbed from the rich and large institutions to distribute among the needy of the region. But the detailed records of counties in Missouri, Kansas, and Indian Territory consistently show that ordinary farmers with modest resources and equally hard lives, with no romanticism to speak of, regularly lost chickens, hogs, work horses, harvested corn, and stored provisions to those same bandits that the ballads made into heroes. The romanticization came later, built on the concrete misery of anonymous people that no urban journalist interviewed with genuine interest and no Hollywood screenwriter immortalized with sympathy or honesty. Andy Adams, in The Log of a Cowboy, recorded with direct honesty how the scarcity of food was a constant reality even for perfectly legitimate groups during the long cattle drives of the 1870s and 1880s. For outlaw groups, without the structure of an organized drive with a fixed official cook and a supply line planned well in advance, the situation was necessarily more precarious and more unpredictable. The pragmatic solution: steal when necessary, buy discreetly when possible, and eat whatever was at hand when neither option was within reach, was simply the logic of survival applied without moral ornaments or philosophical considerations. How outlaws survived in the American Old West was therefore a fundamentally logistical question before it was a question of courage or skill with firearms. The most successful were those who solved the problem of food with the same cold efficiency with which they solved the problem of pursuit. Survival first. Romanticism was a luxury for those who wrote about them afterward, not for those who lived it. Throughout this video, we've knocked down one of the most resilient and most beloved images of cinematic westerns, the idea that Old West outlaws lived a well-fed adventure, with meats roasted over perfect embers, abundant whiskey passing from hand to hand, and rustic feasts under the starlit sky of the prairies. Historical documents, memoirs of the era, the operational records of the U.S. Marshals Service, and the works of historians like T.J. Stiles, Robert Utley, and D. Brown tell a completely different story. Cold beans eaten in the silence of darkness out of fear of smoke, weevil-infested hardtack swallowed without ceremony because there was no alternative, water of dubious origin as a daily and invisible threat, and survival techniques learned directly from native peoples that American cinema always preferred to make invisible in the narrative. The real Old West was defined far more by constant hunger and managed scarcity than by the glory and abundance that became myth on the big screen. Understanding that hunger is an essential part, and perhaps the most honest part, of understanding who those men really were. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these realities about outlaw food surprised you the most in this video? The fact that they deliberately avoided lighting campfires out of fear of being located by the marshals? The discovery that pemmican developed by native peoples was a central survival food that cinema never had the honesty to acknowledge? Or the contrast between the whiskey that's everywhere in the films and the reality of water as the true scarce and potentially deadly resource of the frontier? Drop your choice in the comments. I want to read every answer. If this video changed the way you see the Old West, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. In the next video, we'll explore another completely demystified aspect of outlaw life, something that the movies also never had the guts to show honestly. Don't miss it.